And now, the survival show that once survived, the voice of the apocalypse, whispering tales of doom and destruction in its ear, again and again and again. Howdy and welcome to In the Rabbit Hole's Urban Survival Podcast. This is episode number 238 and the last episode of 2017. Can you believe it? I'm your host, Aaron, and you are in the rabbit hole. Safe and sound. Roughly 5% of all books get made into an audiobook. That's not very many, but it seems nearly all dystopian fiction books are read by Kevin Pierce. Kevin, welcome to In the Rabbit Hole.
I'm glad to be here.
So let's kind of start at the beginning here, where I understand you got your start in radio and TV in like the 70s and 80s. What was that like? And then how did you end up transitioning to book narration? Like fill in the gaps there for us.
I recommend to anybody that wants to get a job in radio, what worked for me was to be born to parents that owned a radio station.
Nepotism.
It was very, very effective. Got me an early job at a little AM station that had to sign off at sundown because its signal would have interfered with a distant station on the same frequency. So my first job was program director wanted to leave at 5 o'clock. And so my job was 5 o'clock till sundown, which was 5 to 5:30 in the early part of the job. And then it extended to where I actually had an hour or so on the air as an announcer on the station. And that was back in 1970s. Mm-hmm. And then I entered the news side of things and was a reporter and anchor on several radio stations. Also television, did some television anchoring and reporting, and then wrapped up radio as a general manager of a small group of stations, one of which was here in Florida.
So you weren't just talent; you also got to the real business end of.
I love it when somebody says you weren't just talent, not just another pretty face. You're right. Yeah, and again, that comes from having family in the business. I was not a general manager for my mother and father, but I had seen that side of the business and had familiarity with it. So that was a sort of a natural path for me. And left that to do voice work and to be not at that time an audiobook narrator, but to do those dozens of other things that require somebody to read and record. And the long form training films and documentaries were stories that were told over many minutes or an hour or more sometimes. And I always was curious about audiobooks, but 20 years ago, there was just zero entry. It was a really small field. You said only a small percentage of books are made into audiobooks at this time. Well, it was a much, much smaller percentage then, much smaller. And the sort of answer I got when reaching out to people in the audiobook business was, if you aren't already doing it, there's no way in. They didn't have need for anybody new to do the books, and they were very specialized, and it was a unique part of the business. And if you didn't already know how to do it, they just didn't have a space. So I got that answer 20 years ago, and I think I made the call 10 years later, and I swear I talked to the same person who gave me the same answer, that it wasn't a growing field. And as a result, there just wasn't there wasn't a need. And another thing that was added to that, if you weren't where they were, you couldn't be working in a distant studio.
Right.
You needed to be working in Grand Rapids, Michigan, because that's where they were recording these things.
Right, because at that point, you're still talking about having to go into a physical studio, I'm guessing.
Sure. With a director and an engineer and people to get you coffee, fancy stuff like that for talent, right?
Right. Well, got to keep the talent happy.
Fast forward to, I guess it was 2012, 2013, and this is after Amazon has sort of democratized parts of publishing and said, we think all books should be published. And if you've written a book, we think it should be available for people to buy, whether it's has any great likelihood of selling or not. Our business model is to take every book that's ever been written and make it available. And so Kindle publishing became multi-billion-dollar business on the back of that kind of thinking. And instead of having to be chosen by a New York editor to be published by a New York publishing company, you and I could decide to write a book today, do it over the next many weeks, and we could publish it on Kindle without asking anybody. And there was obviously millions of people did that. So Amazon's next step, or one of their next steps, was to say, we think all those books that have been published now ought to be audiobooks. And it just so happens that Amazon has bought this audiobook company called Audible. Mm-hmm. And so all of a sudden, there's a marketplace for narrators and rights holders, we call them, people who've written books or own the rights to the books that have been written. This marketplace where these two can get together and decide to create an audiobook, and it'll be published on Audible. Again, I don't have to talk to the person in Grand Rapids, Michigan, or New York, or wherever. I'm talking to the person who's written the book, and we make an agreement to have it produced, and up it goes for sale. So that gateway that Amazon provided through Audible and this sort of independent marketplace is what opened the door for me to get into it.
So why book narration in particular? What was it? Was it just like, hey, this is cool. I got a nice voice and I get to read books all day. This works out well.
It certainly has its perks. I mean, what you described is absolutely true. I mean, I get to read stories. I'll go out at, first thing in the morning, kiss my wife, go out the door, walk the 24 feet to the studio building, and I go into a voiceover booth with a book and I start telling a story. And there are times that hours go by and I haven't thought about anything but that story since I started. Mm-hmm. And it's a fabulous feeling to look up at the clock and say, wow, I'm going to have some lunch here before too long. But in the meantime, I've been totally wrapped up in this story, and it is definitely an enjoyable endeavor. But you ask why? I think I'd always liked the longer form recordings that I'd done, whether it was documentaries or training films. Mm-hmm. They appealed to me more than the 30-second commercial for somebody's car lot. And the story part of it was certainly a part of what made that attractive. But I guess it was just something I always wanted to do. And I actually got a call from Audible, or a studio that Audible was working with, in 2012, I guess, asking if I did audiobooks. And I said, absolutely. I do them all the time. Doing one right now, as a matter of fact, which was a little less than truthful. But it did not, as I look back on it, it didn't get me work. It got me an audition. It got me a chance to read for something. He said, well, since you do them, why don't you read this sample and we'll send it in and see if they'd like to hear you do more. So my first, half dozen books that I ever did were directly for Audible Studios in New York.
Well, I think that kind of explains how you ended up. So you've done, when I checked earlier, you've done over 330 books, and that's in what's really not that long of, not a long span of time. So are you just in that whisper booth 14 hours a day, getting lost in these books? And does your wife have to come knock on the door?
It's usually not that long. There are times that it feels like it. Yeah, there's sort of a physical limit to how much one can actually perform in a day. Mm-hmm. And with errors and edits, and yes, we all make the errors. Yes, we do.
Yeah,
and you do have to go back and re-record sections, and I figure a book usually takes about a week. That's a real large generalization, because some books are shorter than others, some books are longer, some books are more difficult, some books are easier, but I figure about a book a week. Mm-hmm. And I never stop. I'm going from this book to the next, 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 to the next. And I had a conversation with some authors not too long ago. I used to be a voracious pleasure reader. Just absolutely. I read everything. I read every day. I was at the library once a week. I'd check out, 5 books and read 3 of them. Since starting this, sort of a casualty of being an audiobook narrator, I don't read for pleasure anymore. I mean, there's no time for it.
Yeah.
If I'm not in the booth reading a book, performing a book, I'm reading a book in preparation for performing the book.
Mm-hmm.
And there just is not a time of the day that I could pick up the new John Grisham or Stephen King and I miss that, but it's just sort of I smile wistfully as I say it. I miss pleasure reading. And when I go on vacation, that's what I do.
Mm-hmm. I'll
grab a stack of books and, go find a dark corner somewhere and just hole up. Oh, you want to go down to the beach? No, I'm good right here.
So how do you impart the personality and everything in the characters? Do you have to read the book a little bit before you get started, or do you just dive right into it? And
yeah, I think absolutely you have to read the book ahead of time, because you have to know who your characters are going to be, what landmines the author has left for you.
What does that mean?
Suddenly you're going to be speaking native Polish in chapter 19 or reciting, town names in Pacific Northwest or Virginia or Massachusetts, none of which are pronounced as they appear.
Uh-huh.
There's all sorts of technical reasons to read the book first, but the biggest one is just to know what the story is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And because every book is different. And so, yeah, absolutely. The book has to be read first, and it's read sort of at a course level. I might just page through it just to get familiar with the construct of it. How's it laid out? How did the author put the story together? Is it one person telling the story? Is multiple people telling the story?
Mm-hmm.
Who are the characters? Where are the places that we're going to visit? And then go through and actually literally read the book to get ready for it. And there's, all sorts of preparatory shortcuts that all of us narrators take in terms of, do you mark it up with, colored pencil? Do you, use electronic highlighting on an iPad version of it?
Mm-hmm.
And some books will require research. Like I mentioned, books that are set in certain locales. Poland would be no more strange than the Pacific Northwest, which I also mentioned.
Yeah.
You can get lost in those place names really fast.
Uh-huh.
And we learn very quickly that we have to approach proper nouns as if we don't know them, because the first time you think you've got one, I don't have to look that up. I know how to say that. Yeah, no, you don't. And you're wrong in front of, thousands and thousands of people. So definitely reading the book first. Absolutely. And then performing it. And it's all about connecting to the emotion, or the emotional thread anyway, of the story. There's a good amount of acting required. And I always figure that I've been most successful when I can get out of the way of the story, and the story just tells itself. It's this great story, and someone says, "Wow, what a great book! What a great story!" And you say, "Well, what did you think of the narrator?" Oh, yeah, he was fine. He was fine.
Mm-hmm.
That's high praise when you can disappear behind the story and capture all those nuances of where the author has created some emotion for characters, and it can be anger, they can be happy, they can be sad, they can be just about anything, but they've got to be something.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're emotional people, we humans.
Absolutely.
All these stories are about people. They're not about EMPs. They're not about coronal mass ejections. They're not about, die-offs from some kind of plague. That's not what the story's about. The story's about the people who it's either happening to or are surviving in spite of, and how they deal with this new situation they find themselves in.
Yeah. So, and I think that as far as like books that almost tell themselves, do you ever get in advance of a book and then, and not naming any names or anything, but just turn it down and say, this isn't my jam. I'm not feeling it. This is a horribly written book. Sorry. No thanks.
I think it's more common, and the answer is yes. And it's more common when, someone will say, well, gee, I know you're kind of the voice of the apocalypse. I heard somebody say that about you. I'd love you to do my book. Well, and then realize that it's written first person of a young woman. And while I could tell that story and certainly indicate that it's a young woman telling the story, it's going to be a heck of a lot more believable and meaningful and give the narrator that chance to slip back behind the story if it's read by a young woman.
Yeah. Yeah. Kevin Pierce as a 10-year-old Vietnamese girl doesn't seem like.
There you go. Yeah, there you go. Yeah. I'd be willing to give it a try, but. And then time is another bugaboo. There's just a certain, I can only do so much. And when a book is needed to meet some kind of publishing schedule and sort of absolutely has to be in somebody's hand by X date, a lot of times I'm not the right guy for that because it's, going to be a couple, 3 weeks before I can even, consider it. So, so yes, it happens, but usually for more mundane reasons than me taking a stand or something.
I gotcha. So what is your favorite non-prepper book, whether you've been the narrator or not?
Wow, great question. I'll tell you of books that I have narrated, and I realize you gave me an out there, and it didn't have to be that. In addition to working in post-apocalyptic fiction and prepper books and dystopian worlds, I really like true crime books. Absolutely. I tried to think of an overlap because I anticipated that we might talk about this, but I can't. It's just another genre of books, but they're true. They really happened, usually written by people with some journalism in their backgrounds. And I had the good fortune of being asked to read a book from the estate of Jack Olson, who was known as the dean of true crime writers. And truthfully, I didn't know that much about him. I read a little bit. It was impressive, but, I didn't know what I was getting into. Well, they're glorious. They're absolutely amazing stories. And my wife is, in addition to being a wonderful person, she too is a voracious reader. And after I had read several other books from the estate, I will have done most of them here with the next book that I do from there. I asked her one day, I said, would you just take a look at one of these? Just read it and see what you think. Well, I converted her, that one book and she chose not to listen to me read it. I will note.
It sounds like my wife.
She chose to do it the old fashioned way, turning the pages herself. But when she was done, she kind of looked at me with this voiceless shake of her head, like, wow. Yeah, it's the genre is amazing. And then Jack Olson, any of the Jack Olson books, they're spectacular. Word choice, storytelling, interviews, it's amazing stuff. So there's your answer. Any of the Jack Olson true crime books are among my favorites.
Neat. I'm going to have to check that out. We'll be back after this quick break. Listener, do you get at least $3 a month worth of value out of I2RH? You should see what we do for the Roving Horde Armada members. Check it out today by visiting i2rh.net. Members get access to episodes a day early, access to monthly virtual and in-person meetups in some areas, an invitation to the secret I2RH Armada Facebook group so you can chat about survival all day long with like-minded people, access to every episode ever produced by I2RH. That's right, all the way back to the beginning, including one that was never aired. And those are just a few things you get with your membership when you sign up and become part of the I2RH Roving Horde by going to i2rh.net. Again, that's i2rh.net. So now I think the big question that everybody wants to know is, do you consider yourself a prepper, or are you a prepper?
Yeah, great question. I'm going to say no, but certainly I am not prepared for the end of the world as we know it. But I live in Florida and have lived in Florida almost all my life. So the level of preparedness that we have, or some of us have, as a result of being in the gun side of a hurricane every year, I'm a heck of a lot more prepared than most people. And I think the big difference is, or a big difference, where somebody with a more prepper mindset, like many of the characters that I read about in the books that I narrate, they're ready to go on self-sustaining. I mean, it's just they will take care of themselves from today forward. You know, they're going to raise the livestock, they're going to plant the crops. They've got everything thought through to where, you know, they are prepared. When you do good hurricane preparation, you know, you're not getting ready for the end of the world, but you are getting ready to be self-sufficient for a period.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, we look at 7 to 10 days as sort of, that could happen. You know, that's a very realistic scenario that you could be 7 to 10 days without any help.
Mm-hmm.
And here in this last hurricane season, we had Hurricane Irma made. It was the second U.S. landfall, so it went through Key West and then came up across Florida Bay, and it made landfall just a couple dozen miles south of my house. And we had to get ready for that. It was one of those storms that got you in the sights and then never let you out of it. So we'd been looking at this storm for a good 7 days prior to it getting here. And it just kept coming and it kept coming and it kept coming. And certainly making landfall as one of the most powerful storms ever to hit the U.S. We were without electricity at my urban house for 2 weeks. And, you know, that's not to say that we were without help and supplies for 2 weeks, but it was certainly nice to go into those first several days post-storm without having to scramble to get things or do things, because we had prepared. We were ready for a lot of the things that happened. Getting ready early, one of the first things I checked, you have your food and water set aside, and, you know, let's check flashlights. Well, we had invested in good flashlights. Let's don't say a brand name, but let's just say they were magnificent flashlights. And, you know, cost a couple bucks to do it that way, but we wanted good ones. And I went in to check to make sure that both my wife and I would have access to one and that they were working, and they were. I said, well, you know, this would probably be a good time to let's put fresh batteries in, you know, so that we're going into this likely need of a flashlight with flashlights that are in their best possible condition. And upon opening these magnificent flashlights, the 3 double Ds in each of them had split and swelled and did their rotten battery wasting routine on the inside of the lights. And I couldn't get the old batteries out. So, you know, this is the first hurricane in my history that we were able to use Amazon Prime to get ready for. And I ordered new flashlights to be delivered as this storm was barreling its way toward us. And sure enough, they arrived and everything was great. And those replacement flashlights were much smaller. And I can tell you that mine did not leave my person for the 2 weeks after the storm. It was in a cargo pocket, or somebody asked if they could borrow my flashlight. They said, nope, I'll take you someplace. But I am not giving this thing up because, you know, when the power's out and the sun goes down, it gets dark.
Yes, it does. Yeah. When there's no power, I think most people, especially if and the bigger the city that gets, the more disconnected they get from understanding what life without lights is like.
Yep. And we have, you know, we're a residential neighborhood. We've got street lights out front. Well, you know, at night, inside our house, we have light coming in from the street lights. Mm-hmm. So the house is never dark. It's nighttime dark, right? Mm-hmm. Well, during these 2 weeks post-storm, it was dark, man. Mm. And having those there's a company called Through Night makes these little flashlights, and they were just a godsend for us. And but so that goes to answer your question about, you know, being a prepper. Certainly, I can't own that mantle, but definitely we were prepared with 10 days of food that not meals ready to eat by any means.
Right.
But I did use the requirement that we had to be able to eat them without heat. Mm-hmm. Might not be the chosen way to eat them, but if we were in a situation that we needed to get into this food, it was because it was a disaster. And if we needed to eat it without heat and we were able to, I can do that in a disaster. I can eat Chef Boyardee ravioli, not heated up, straight from the can.
Yes.
If that's what I need to do to get my lunchtime calories in today, you better believe I can do that. Yeah. And I even demonstrated that it could be done just to prove a point.
Yeah.
Obviously, I'd rather heat it up if we've got that option. But I felt very comfortable just knowing that we were prepared with food and water, in the event that it was a disaster. And the good news is, we were really just dramatically inconvenienced being without power for 2 weeks, but not harmed in any way.
Yeah. Hopefully for most people that ends up being the case. I know we've been through that a few times, both my wife and I, because we both grew up here on the Gulf Coast. So yeah, I've experienced it. It's usually just an inconvenience and an excuse to drink a lot. But that is the nature of living on the water as we do. So does your outlook on that ever change after you read a book? You get done reading one of these dystopian books and go, maybe we do need some guns and long-term stuff or anything like that? Or is it just,
Does it change? Yes. And quite often it's the little details that an author will weave in. For the first time ever, we evacuated or were asked to evacuate our house. They were really concerned about storm surge with Hurricane Irma. Mm-hmm. And we're not far from the river that runs through our town. But still, they never considered this to be a mandatory evacuation area. We're not a barrier island or a mobile home park, which those things are asked to evacuate when the breeze stiffens.
Yeah.
But they went into the sort of second stage, the second level of things. And on the Saturday before the Sunday storm, I had our dog out for a walk. Lo and behold, comes the fire truck down the street with a fireman and a megaphone, pointing at me and telling me that I was in a mandatory evacuation zone and needed to prepare to beat feet, which you don't have to go. And our plan had been to shelter in place and stay in the house. But having that experience, I said, maybe we've been invited to the other inland house. Perhaps, maybe we should go in there during just the brunt of the storm. So that's what we did. And the home we were at, and this is by way of answer to your question, much higher elevation, had been all boarded up, hurricane shutters all the way around. So it was a much safer place to be. And they were on a well. And as the storm was reaching its fury, and knowing that the power was about to go out, because that always happens during a storm, the question is, how long will it be out?
Right.
I said without thinking, we need to get some waste cans and fill them with water so that we'll be able to flush the toilets after the power goes out and the well is no longer providing pressure to the water system. My dad looked at me and said, how do you know that? And I said, I know exactly how I know that. I read that in a book, as a matter of fact. But I know it to be true. And sure enough, not 30 minutes later, the power went out and the well stopped performing. And thank goodness we had receptacles ready and a swimming pool full of water that we were able to keep sanitation going. But so there's a lot of those little nuggets, and I don't know that it changes my outlook necessarily. Am I more worried about North Korea? Am I more worried about coronal mass ejections? Am I worried about EMPs? I don't know that that's necessarily true, but it definitely, these books have raised my awareness of things that I would have otherwise not been aware of. And so many helpful things, and then many things just, you want to consider these things as you getting ready, as I said, for hurricane season even. The things that I thought about for hurricane season were very different having read all those books than they would have been had I not read all those books.
Do you ever get twitchy after you read one of these books, after you spend so much headspace and essentially part of what you're doing is studying these books beforehand? Do you get done and you're just like, oh God?
I'll tell you that I went to Publix, it would be the day before the storm. Publix is our dominant grocery chain here in Southwest Florida. Mm-hmm. There was something that we needed that I knew they'd have. It was neither canned food nor bottled water. It was something that I knew they actually would have and wouldn't have already been shelf run on it. Uh-huh. And as I pulled into the parking lot of the grocery store the day before the natural disaster, I said, almost every book I read, there's a gunfight in the parking lot of the grocery store. Because, this is where people want to take your stuff. And I said, right. Okay, head on a swivel now. Let's go in. Let's be situationally aware. Where do I want to park? How can I make this so that I can get out of here fast? I need to get directly to the car with my load and, don't make eye contact with anybody. We need to get out of here. So yes, there is room for a little twitch after some of these.
Wow, that's pretty funny. So going back to your career as a voiceover artist and as a narrator, what would you say is like the most influential moment in that career that you felt like really propelled you forward?
Shortly after starting to work in audiobooks, I knew I was doing okay work, but I also knew that it could be better, and I didn't know quite what I needed to do to get better. And I spent some time with a director in New York. Much as a movie has a director, audiobooks used to have directors. Mm-hmm. And it was life-changing for me. The things he had me consider, and really his goal was to get me to where I could direct myself and sort of ask the same questions he was asking of me. So, here I'm in a situation where I have a director and the director is asking me these things. The goal was so that I could go back to my own studio and internally hear those same questions being asked. And they would be questions like, what emotion do you think that character is feeling right now? And perhaps the answer was anger. Okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, how angry do you think you made that character sound? And I'll give you a hint. The reason the director is asking you this is because you didn't get it, right? Mm-hmm. So, you kind of mentally play it back and say probably, 4. How angry do you think they were on a scale of 1 to 10? Mm-hmm. And the answer is always 10, because, who is ever somewhat angry in a book, who is ever somewhat scared, whoever they're a 10, they'd be a 12 if the scale went that high. And so the goal is to get you to recognize that, this character is having some emotion, that the emotion needs to be portrayed, and that you didn't do quite the emotional portrayal that you might have done. So maybe we could try that again. And so, working with the director in New York, really, it just changed things completely. And one of the things that you'll appreciate this with the work that you do around studio equipment in broadcasting, in most voice fields, projection is a huge goal. It's desirable. We radio people, we TV people, we talk loud. We push a great deal of volume out. Mm-hmm. And it gets you that sound that you're used to when you're listening to television or radio news, is that big projecting voice that says, hello there. Well, in audiobooks, it's completely opposite that. It's completely opposite that. It's as if I'm standing next to you. You're looking north, and I'm on your west, and I'm looking east, right into your ear. And I'm telling you a story right into your ear. I'm not standing 5 feet away telling you this story. My chin is touching your shoulder. I'm in your space. I'm telling you this story. And it calls for a much It calls for much less voice, much less voice. And that's a huge part of the canon of audiobook storytelling is they use the word intimate. It's incredibly intimate.
Yeah.
You think about, you put earbuds in, you didn't put them on, you put them in, and that's where that voice is coming from. And, you don't want somebody telling you this story. The guy came down the road. You're not looking for Gilbert Gottfried telling you the story. It's a much more. You can still have tons of energy in it.
Yeah.
Anyway, physically, it's a very different thing, and that too came from working with that director. And so I went from never having narrated an audiobook to that's all I do.
That's really neat. So, Kevin, how can people connect with you? What is the best way? If they want to keep up with The Voice of the Apocalypse or any of the other non-apocalyptic books you read, because you do read a fair amount of those too, how do they connect with you?
Well, the website, which doesn't get much work anymore, is kevinpierce.com. And the most common place to find me is, I never thought I'd say this, Facebook. It's where I'm in contact with the guys who are telling, the scribblers who are telling these stories. It's just a real easy way to keep up on, what's the next book, what's next up in the audiobook studio, and what's being released this week. What's coming down the pipe from these fabulous authors that I'm working with, and the fabulous ones that I haven't worked with yet, but hope to in 2018. It's a great place to stay in touch, and it's a great place to stay in touch with these fabulous authors as well.
Fantastic. Kevin, thank you so much for joining us today. I really appreciate it. It has been a special treat to get to speak with the Voice of the Apocalypse.
Aaron, it's delightful. Thank you.
Show notes, links to Kevin Pierce, and other resources from this episode can be found by going to intherabbithole.com/E238. Support the show and get E238 Roving Horde Armada members-only benefits. Like what, you ask? Great question. Like twice monthly virtual hangs, access to the secret E238 Armada Facebook group, and the on-demand bug-out bag class. That's just to name a few things you get when you go to E238.net to become part of the E238 Roving Horde Armada. Now, a bit more about the virtual hangs, because I get asked about this a lot. Twice a month, members get on a private, secure video chat to talk about guns, current events, mead, food storage, the 50 caliber Beowulf rifles, or whatever's on their mind. Go to E238.net to read more. Again, that's E238.net to find out about the exclusive members-only benefits. With that, we wrap up episode number 238 from the Lone Star State. Till next time, stay safe and sound.